The British soldiers of the 11th Armored Division had fought their way across Europe, seen death on battlefields from Normandy to the Rhine, witnessed the devastation of total war, but nothing prepared them for what they found when they entered Bergen-Belsen concentration camp on April 15, 1945. The smell hit them first, death and disease carried on the spring wind, overwhelming and inescapable. Then came the sights that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bodies piled in heaps, thousands of corpses in various states of decomposition, living skeletons wandering among the dead, barely able to stand, eyes hollow with starvation and disease. And children, so many children, their small bodies wasted to bones wrapped in skin, many too weak to cry, lying in filth, waiting for death that had already claimed so many of their companions. In the final months of World War II, Bergen-Belsen had become a dumping ground for evacuated prisoners from camps across Europe, a place where the Third Reich sent those it had condemned to die slowly from neglect, starvation, and disease. Among the approximately 60,000 prisoners found at liberation, thousands were children who had survived Auschwitz, survived the death marches westward, only to find themselves dying in a camp where no gas chambers existed because passive murder through calculated neglect proved just as effective. Bergen-Belsen had begun its existence in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp for Allied soldiers, particularly from the Soviet Union. But by 1943, the SS had transformed sections of it into a complex of camps serving different purposes. One section became an exchange camp, where Jews deemed valuable for potential prisoner swaps were held. Another became a recovery camp, where prisoners too sick to work in other camps were supposedly sent to recuperate, although most simply died there. By late 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied armies pushed from the west, Bergen-Belsen became a collection point for evacuated prisoners, a last-stop destination for those the Nazis could no longer keep in camps being liberated or abandoned. The camp that had been designed to hold a few thousand soon contained tens of thousands with no corresponding increase in food, water, sanitation, or shelter. Among the evacuees were children from Auschwitz-Birkenau, survivors of selections who had somehow avoided the gas chambers. In November 1944, a transport of 8,000 women from Auschwitz arrived, including 15-year-old Anne Frank and her 17-year-old sister Margot. The Frank sisters, already weakened by months in Auschwitz, found Bergen-Belsen even worse in some ways. At Auschwitz, death came quickly through the gas chambers. At Bergen-Belsen, death came slowly, through starvation, through typhus and tuberculosis and dysentery, through exposure to cold and wet, through the complete breakdown of any pretense of care or humanity. The camp had no gas chambers, no systematic murder program. It did not need them. The conditions themselves were lethal, designed, whether through deliberate policy or criminal neglect, to kill through deprivation. Children at Bergen-Belsen faced particular horrors beyond even the general nightmare of camp existence. Their small bodies required nutrition for growth and development, but they received the same starvation rations as adults if they received anything at all. By early 1945, food distribution had largely collapsed. Rations that had always been inadequate shrank to almost nothing. Children went days without eating. Their bodies, still growing or trying to, consumed themselves, breaking down muscle and organ tissue in desperate attempts to find energy. Growth stopped, development halted. Children who should have been going through puberty remained frozen in childhood, their bodies unable to mature without proper nutrition. The overcrowding created conditions where disease spread with terrifying speed. Bergen-Belsen by early 1945 held over 60,000 people in a space designed for a fraction of that number. The barracks, already insufficient, could not accommodate everyone. Thousands slept in tents that collapsed in winter storms, leaving prisoners exposed to rain, snow, and freezing temperatures. Others had no shelter at all, sleeping on the ground, huddled together for warmth that never came. Children, with less body mass to provide insulation, suffered particularly from the cold. They died of exposure, their small bodies unable to maintain core temperature, freezing to death even as spring approached. The sanitation system, inadequate even for the camp's original capacity, completely collapsed under the massive overcrowding. There were not enough latrines, and those that existed overflowed constantly. Human waste contaminated everything: the ground, the water supply, the air itself. Typhus, spread by lice that thrived in the unsanitary conditions, became epidemic. The disease causes high fever, severe headaches, and delirium. In weakened prisoners, particularly children, it was often fatal. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water, left victims unable to retain any nutrition, accelerating starvation. Tuberculosis attacked lungs already damaged by poor nutrition and exposure. Children died from all these diseases, their immature immune systems unable to fight infections that even healthy adults would struggle to survive. Only some children had older siblings able to look out for them, but sadly, the outcome for almost all was much the same, as there were no resources.
The psychological trauma added another layer of suffering. These children had already endured experiences that should never touch childhood. Many had watched parents and siblings selected for gas chambers at Auschwitz or other camps. They had survived by hiding, by lying about their ages, by luck and the arbitrary decisions of SS officers during selections. They had witnessed industrial murder on a scale that defied comprehension. Now at Bergen-Belsen, they faced a different kind of death, slower but just as certain. They watched other children die daily, sometimes children they had befriended during the transport or in the brief time at the camp. They became numb to death, a defensive mechanism that allowed them to function but cost them something essential of their humanity and childhood. 15-year-old Hannah-Laura Klein, who had survived Auschwitz with her mother, arrived at Bergen-Belsen in late 1944. She remembered the shock of seeing children younger than herself, some barely 10 or 11 years old, wandering the camp like walking corpses. These children had somehow survived the initial selections at Auschwitz because they were tall for their age, or because older siblings had lied about their ages, or because in the chaos of arrival they had been processed as older than they were. Now they faced death at Bergen-Belsen, not from gas, but from starvation and disease that worked just as efficiently, if more slowly and painfully. The camp administration, under Commandant Josef Kramer, showed no interest in preventing deaths. Kramer, who had previously served at Auschwitz-Birkenau, brought with him the callousness and brutality that had made him one of the most feared SS officers. Nicknamed the Beast of Belsen, he implemented policies that accelerated suffering and death. Food rations were cut repeatedly. Medical care, already minimal, ceased almost entirely. Kramer and his guards watched prisoners die with indifference or satisfaction, seeing them not as human beings, but as burdens to be eliminated through neglect. By March 1945, Bergen-Belsen had descended into complete chaos. The camp was receiving evacuees from other camps at a rate far beyond any capacity to accommodate them. Trains arrived filled with prisoners, many already dead from the journey, the survivors too weak to walk. Children were among these arrivals, some traveling without parents or guardians, separated during evacuations or orphaned by earlier killings. They stumbled off the trains into a camp where no one cared for them, where survival depended entirely on individual strength and luck, both of which were rapidly depleting. In that final month before liberation, approximately 18,000 people died at Bergen-Belsen. The death rate had accelerated to the point where even the most basic burial procedures collapsed. Bodies lay everywhere, in the barracks, along the pathways, in piles near the crematorium that had long since been overwhelmed. Children walked past corpses as though they were furniture, barely noticing because death had become so commonplace. Some children died alone, too weak to call for help, their small bodies found days later among the piles of dead. Others died in the arms of mothers or siblings who could do nothing except hold them as life slipped away. Anne and Margot Frank died sometime in late February or early March 1945, both victims of typhus. Witnesses later described how Anne, weakened by malnutrition and disease, had lost the will to live after Margot died. The deaths of the Frank sisters, while tragic, were not unique. Hundreds of children died in those same weeks from the same causes. They died from typhus, from starvation, from exposure, from the simple exhaustion of bodies that had endured too much. Their deaths were not recorded individually. They became statistics, numbers added to the mounting death toll, bodies thrown into mass graves without ceremony or identification. When British forces finally liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they encountered scenes that defied their understanding and exceeded the limits of their preparation and training. They found approximately 55,000 surviving prisoners, many so close to death that liberation came too late to save them. They found 13,000 corpses lying unburied throughout the camp, many more buried in shallow mass graves. And they found children, thousands of children, in states of physical deterioration that shocked even hardened soldiers. 8-year-old children who weighed less than 40 pounds, teenagers who looked like elderly people, infants barely alive. The British medical personnel, despite their best efforts, faced an impossible situation. The surviving prisoners were suffering from extreme malnutrition, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and numerous other ailments. They needed immediate medical care, proper nutrition, clean water, and sanitation. But the resources were inadequate, and the knowledge of how to treat such extreme starvation was limited. In a tragic irony, some of the first efforts to help actually hastened deaths. Soldiers, horrified by the starvation they witnessed, gave prisoners rich tinned rations from their own supplies. But bodies that had adapted to starvation could not process such rich food. An estimated 2,000 people died from refeeding syndrome, their digestive systems unable to handle normal food after months of near total starvation. Medical teams were rushed from Britain, including nearly 100 medical students from London hospitals. They worked desperately to save lives, experimenting with different feeding protocols, trying to find ways to reintroduce nutrition gradually enough that bodies could adapt. For the children, the medical staff felt particular urgency and heartbreak. Children should not look like elderly people. Children should not be dying from diseases associated with extreme old age or conditions found in famine-stricken regions. Yet here were thousands of children in exactly those states, victims of calculated cruelty disguised as wartime necessity. Despite heroic efforts, more than 13,000 prisoners died after liberation, many of them children whose bodies were too damaged to recover. They survived the camps, survived the evacuations, lived to see British soldiers arrive, but could not survive the damage that had been done to them. Parents who had protected children through Auschwitz, through the death marches, through Bergen-Belsen, watched helplessly as those children died after liberation, their bodies finally giving out once the immediate threat had passed. The grief was overwhelming, liberation transforming into another form of loss. The children who survived faced long recovery processes, both physical and psychological. They needed months of careful feeding to regain weight safely. They needed treatment for diseases that had ravaged their systems. They needed dental care for teeth damaged by malnutrition. They needed help with development that had been arrested by years of starvation. Many would never reach the height they should have achieved, their growth stunted permanently. Others faced lifelong health complications from the damage that had been done during critical developmental years.
The psychological recovery proved even more difficult. These children had witnessed and experienced trauma that exceeded normal human capacity to process and integrate. They had nightmares, flashbacks, overwhelming anxiety. They struggled to trust adults, having learned that adults could be monsters who inflicted suffering without mercy. They hoarded food compulsively, unable to believe that starvation would not return. They had difficulty forming attachments, fearing the loss that had defined their lives. Many carried survivor's guilt, unable to understand why they had lived when so many others, often siblings or friends, had died. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen became one of the most documented events of the Holocaust's end. British military photographers and cameramen recorded everything, understanding that the world needed to see what had been done. The footage and photographs shocked audiences worldwide. Images of bulldozers pushing mountains of corpses into mass graves, of emaciated survivors barely able to stand, of children who looked like ancient people, all forced the world to confront the reality of Nazi atrocities. The children of Bergen-Belsen became symbols of Nazi cruelty and the cost of hatred taken to its logical conclusion. After liberation, Bergen-Belsen transformed into a displaced persons camp, housing survivors who had nowhere else to go. Between 1945 and 1950, life continued in the former camp, though now under British administration and with proper food and medical care. Remarkably, over 2,000 babies were born in the DP camp, a testament to life reasserting itself even in places associated with death. But the children who had been liberated from the concentration camp proper carried scars that would never fade, physical and psychological damage that would affect them for their entire lives. The stories of individual child survivors reveal the specific horrors behind the statistics. 14-year-old Rachel Ganuth arrived at Bergen-Belsen in December 1944 after surviving Auschwitz. She had been separated from her parents during the initial selection, watching helplessly as they were sent to the left toward the gas chambers, while she was sent to the right with those deemed fit for work. At Auschwitz, she had lied about her age, claiming to be 16, and her height had saved her from immediate death. But at Bergen-Belsen, there was no work, no selections based on productivity. There was only waiting to die, which happened with mechanical regularity as starvation and disease claimed lives daily. Rachel remembered the cold most vividly, the way it penetrated everything, turning fingers and toes black with frostbite, making even breathing painful. She remembered the lice that infested every surface, every piece of clothing, every strand of hair, biting constantly, spreading the typhus that killed so many. She remembered the taste of the watery soup that was the only food, how it had no flavor except a vague vegetable bitterness, how it provided barely enough calories to keep the heart beating, but not enough to prevent the body from consuming itself. She remembered watching younger children, some barely 8 or 9, die quietly in corners of the barracks, too weak to cry, too far gone to save. The children at Bergen-Belsen developed survival strategies that revealed both their desperation and their ingenuity. They formed small groups, looking out for each other, sharing whatever scraps of food they could find. They learned to recognize which guards might be bribed with valuables that some prisoners still possessed, trading watches or rings for a piece of bread or extra soup. They learned to avoid certain areas of the camp where the dying were concentrated, not out of callousness, but out of recognition that disease spread fastest where the weakest gathered. They learned to move slowly to conserve energy, to sleep as much as possible to reduce caloric needs, to drink as much water as they could find, even when that water was contaminated and likely to cause more problems. Some children maintained routines that preserved fragments of normalcy and sanity. 12-year-old Eva Schloss, who would later become Anne Frank's posthumous stepsister, remembered teaching a younger girl the alphabet, scratching letters in the dirt with a stick, maintaining the fiction that there would be a future where reading mattered. Other children told stories, recounting fairy tales, or inventing adventures, creating worlds in their imaginations where hunger did not exist and families were whole. These mental escapes provided brief respite from unbearable reality, moments where they could be children rather than prisoners waiting to die. The arrival of new transports brought both hope and despair. Hope because new arrivals sometimes brought news from the outside world, whispered information about the war's progress, rumors that Germany was losing and liberation might be coming. Despair because each new transport meant more people crowded into already impossible conditions, more competition for the inadequate food and space, more disease vectors as people from different regions brought different strains of illness. Children watched new arrivals, trying to identify relatives or friends from their hometowns, hoping for impossible reunions that rarely occurred. The camp contained children from across Europe, each group carrying its own trauma and speaking its own language. Polish children who had survived the Warsaw Ghetto and the deportations to Auschwitz, Hungarian children from the massive deportations of spring and summer of 1944, Czech children from Theresienstadt, Dutch children like Anne Frank who had been in hiding before capture, German Jewish children who had experienced years of escalating persecution before deportation, Czech children from Theresienstadt. These children, thrown together by circumstance, sometimes formed bonds across language barriers, communicating through gestures and shared suffering that transcended words. The religious life that had sustained many Jewish communities before the war became nearly impossible to maintain at Bergen-Belsen. There were no prayer books, no ritual objects, no way to observe dietary laws that had become cruelly irrelevant when any food at all was a blessing. Yet some children and adults tried to maintain fragments of religious practice, marking the Sabbath mentally, if not openly, remembering holidays and their meanings, holding on to faith as the only thing the Nazis could not completely take away. For some, this faith provided comfort and meaning. For others, the horrors of the camp destroyed any belief in a benevolent God who would allow such suffering.
The role of mothers and older siblings in protecting younger children at Bergen-Belsen was both heroic and tragic. Women who were themselves starving gave portions of their meager rations to children, sacrificing their own survival for a few more days of life for a child. Older sisters, some barely teenagers themselves, took on maternal roles for younger siblings, trying to provide comfort and protection in situations where both were illusory. These caretakers faced impossible choices, deciding whether to share their bread with a dying child or save it for themselves or other children who might have better chances of survival. The moral calculus of the camp reduced life to brutal equations where every decision carried life or death consequences. The liberation brought its own traumas for the children. British soldiers, trying to be kind, sometimes made situations worse through ignorance of how to treat such extreme starvation. They gave chocolate to children who had not tasted sugar in years, not realizing that rich food could kill digestive systems adapted to near starvation. They separated sick children from mothers to treat them in hospitals, not understanding that the psychological trauma of another separation could be as damaging as physical illness. They asked children about their families, not realizing that most had watched parents and siblings murdered, and that questions about family brought pain rather than comfort. The medical treatment of liberated children revealed the extent of damage that years of starvation and abuse had inflicted. Doctors found children whose bone development had been arrested, leaving them with skeletal structures that would never properly mature. They found girls who had stopped menstruating and might not regain fertility, their reproductive systems shut down by malnutrition. They found children with organ damage, particularly to liver and kidneys, from months of processing toxins with inadequate nutrition. They found dental decay so severe that many children had lost most of their teeth. They found psychological trauma so profound that some children could not speak, retreating into silence as the only safe response to overwhelming horror. The process of refeeding required careful medical supervision. Doctors developed protocols for gradually increasing caloric intake, starting with easily digestible foods in small quantities and slowly building to normal portions over weeks or months. Even with careful management, some children's bodies could not adapt. Their digestive systems had been damaged beyond repair, their organs too compromised to process food properly. They died not from starvation, but from the attempt to reverse it, their bodies giving out when salvation seemed at hand. The medical staff who treated these children carried the trauma of these losses for the rest of their lives.
haunted by children they could not save despite their best efforts. The documentation of Bergen-Belsen created a visual record that shocked the world and became crucial evidence in post-war trials. British military photographers took thousands of images, recording every aspect of the liberation. The footage of emaciated children, of bodies being bulldozed into mass graves, of survivors too weak to celebrate their freedom, all became part of the historical record that made denial of the Holocaust impossible. These images, as disturbing as they were, served a purpose beyond documentation. They forced the world to confront what had been done in the name of racial ideology and nationalist fervor. The children in these photographs and films became symbols of innocence destroyed, of childhood stolen, of the ultimate costs of hatred taken to its logical extreme. In the weeks and months following liberation, as survivors slowly regained strength and began the impossible task of rebuilding lives from nothing, the question of what to do with orphan children became urgent. Thousands of children had survived Bergen-Belsen without parents or guardians. They needed homes, families, futures. Jewish organizations worked to place orphans with relatives, if any could be found, or with foster families in countries willing to accept them. The process was complicated by the chaos of post-war Europe, by the difficulty of verifying identities and family connections, by the reluctance of some countries to accept large numbers of refugees, even child refugees. Some children found new homes in Palestine, which would become Israel in 1948. Youth Aliyah and other organizations worked to transport orphan children from the DP camps to kibbutzim and other settlements. For these children, the journey from Bergen-Belsen to Palestine represented a complete transformation, from death camp prisoner to pioneer building a new nation. But the trauma came with them, manifesting in nightmares, in difficulty forming attachments, in behaviors shaped by survival in conditions where trust could be fatal. The new communities struggled to understand and accommodate children whose experiences had been so extreme. Other children were adopted by families in Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries. These adoptions, while providing material security and love, created their own complications. The children often could not or would not speak about what they had endured, creating gaps in their histories that adoptive families struggled to bridge. They celebrated birthdays that might not be their real birthdays, bore names that might not be their original names, carried identities constructed from fragments and guesses. The disconnection from their origins added another layer of loss to lives already defined by absence and grief. The trial of Josef Kramer and other Bergen-Belsen staff began in September 1945 at Lüneburg, only months following liberation. Survivors, including some teenage children, testified about the conditions they had endured and the deliberate cruelty of camp personnel. Kramer showed no remorse, arguing that he had simply followed orders and that conditions at the camp were the result of war circumstances beyond his control. The court rejected these defenses. Kramer and 10 other defendants were sentenced to death and hanged in December 1945. The trials established precedent for holding camp administrators accountable for crimes against humanity, though many who had served at Bergen-Belsen escaped justice through death, flight, or the chaos of the immediate post-war period. For the child survivors who testified, the trial was both cathartic and re-traumatizing. They had to recount experiences they were trying to forget, describe horrors they could barely articulate, face their tormentors across a courtroom when they were still psychologically children, despite what they had endured. Some found strength in testimony, feeling they spoke for those who had died and could not speak for themselves. Others found the experience overwhelming, breaking down during testimony or suffering nightmares and flashbacks that made them relive trauma they thought was safely in the past.
As the children who survived Bergen-Belsen grew into adulthood, they faced challenges that distinguished them from people with normal childhoods. Many struggled with relationships and intimacy, the trust required for close relationships damaged by betrayals and losses of the camp years. Some became overprotective parents, unable to let children out of their sight, compulsively hoarding food and resources, preparing for disasters their children could not imagine. Others went the opposite direction, becoming distant and emotionally unavailable, unable to access feelings that had been shut down as survival mechanisms during the camps. The patterns of behavior learned at Bergen-Belsen shaped personalities and relationships decades after liberation. The phenomenon of survivor's guilt affected many child survivors particularly intensely. They had lived when parents, siblings, friends had died. They could not understand or accept the randomness of their survival, the arbitrary factors that had placed them on the side of life rather than death. Some spent their lives searching for meaning in their survival, dedicating themselves to testimony and education, determined that their continued existence would honor those who had died. Others struggled with feeling they did not deserve to live, that their survival was somehow illegitimate or unearned. These feelings, combined with the trauma of what they had witnessed and endured, led to high rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder among survivors. The medical community's understanding of childhood trauma evolved significantly through study of Holocaust survivors, including children from Bergen-Belsen. Researchers documented the long-term physical and psychological effects of extreme childhood starvation and trauma. They found that survivors had higher rates of certain diseases, including cardiovascular problems and certain cancers, likely related to the severe malnutrition and stress of their camp experiences. They found that trauma experienced in childhood had different and often more severe effects than trauma experienced in adulthood, altering brain development and creating patterns of stress response that lasted lifetimes. This research contributed to modern understanding of developmental trauma and informed treatment approaches for children who experience extreme adversity. In recent decades, as survivors aged and their numbers dwindled, efforts intensified to record and preserve their testimonies. Organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum collected thousands of video testimonies from survivors, including many who had been children at Bergen-Belsen. These testimonies provide invaluable first-person accounts of what happened, but they also reveal the lasting impacts of childhood imprisonment. Even survivors in their 70s and 80s, speaking 60 or 70 years after liberation, showed visible emotion when discussing their experiences. The trauma had not faded with time. It remained present, a defining feature of their lives and identities. The generation of children who survived Bergen-Belsen is now almost gone. Each year brings obituaries of survivors, each death marking the loss of another direct witness to what happened. The youngest survivors, those who were infants or toddlers at liberation, are now in their late 70s or 80s. Within a generation, there will be no living survivors who experienced Bergen-Belsen as children. This creates urgency around documentation and education, ensuring that when the last survivor is gone, their stories will remain, preserved in testimony, memoir, and historical record. The site of Bergen-Belsen today is a place of somber remembrance. The mass graves where thousands were buried remain, marked by mounds and memorial stones. The Documentation Center, opened in 2007, tells the story of the camp and its victims through exhibits, artifacts, and testimony. School groups visit regularly, learning about the Holocaust through the specific example of Bergen-Belsen. The children who visit today, safe and well-fed, try to imagine what it was like for children their age to be imprisoned and dying where they now stand. The disconnect between present peace and past horror is almost impossible to bridge, yet the attempt to understand and remember continues. Today, Bergen-Belsen exists as a memorial site. The barracks burned in 1945 to prevent disease spread, the grounds now peaceful and green. But the memory of what happened there, particularly to the children, remains. The children of Bergen-Belsen represent the ultimate victims of a system that saw human beings as expendable, that created conditions designed to kill through neglect and deprivation. They were prisoners of war in every meaningful sense, civilians held captive and subjected to conditions that violated every standard of human decency and the laws of war. Their suffering and the suffering of the thousands who did not survive stands as testimony to the depths of cruelty humans can inflict and the resilience some display in surviving it.
The children who died at Bergen-Belsen and those who survived carrying lifelong scars demand that we remember, that we bear witness, that we ensure such atrocities are never repeated. Their voices, preserved in testimony and memory, call across the decades with a simple message: never forget what was done to us, never let it happen again.